When the Korean War broke out on June 25, 1950, the U.S. Air Force's largest overseas command, FEAF, commanded by Lieutenant General George Stratemeyer, possessed 1,172 aircraft, dispersed among its three air forces. The 13th Air Force stationed in the Philippines, the 5th Air Force stationed in Japan, and the 20th Air Force stationed in Okinawa and the Marianas. As South Korean forces faced a critical retreat, President Truman directed General MacArthur to provide cover for their withdrawal. In response, General Stratemeyer redeployed the 19th Bombardment Group of B-29 bombers from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam to Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, positioning them for immediate action. Just days later, on June 30, 1950, President Truman gave the U.S. Air Force the green light to launch direct airstrikes against North Korean targets, further intensifying the conflict. In response to the escalating conflict, U.S. military leadership took swift action. Orders were issued for U.S. Army units to support South Korean forces in the defense of their territory, while the U.S. Navy was directed to impose a blockade on North Korean harbors. On July 3, 1950, Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg, with the backing of the JCS, sanctioned the temporary reassignment of two B-29 bomber groups, the 22nd and 92nd, from SAC to the FEAF, marking a critical escalation in air operations over the Korean Peninsula. On July 7, the Security Council authorized the United States to establish a unified UN command in Korea. The next day, President Truman named General MacArthur the UN commander. Meanwhile, at Yokota Air Base, Japan, General Stratemeyer established FEAF Bomber Command, composed of the 1 B-29 group he already possessed plus two being sent as reinforcements. General Vandenberg appointed Major General Emmett O'Donnell as its first commander, and on July 7 O'Donnell carried to Japan a list of possible targets and his own plan to use incendiaries against North Korean cities. By July 11, 1950, FEAF Bomber Command had three groups of B-29s for a total of 81 aircraft. Since June 28, bombers of the Kadena-based 19th Bombardment Group had been flying combat sorties against North Korean lines of communication in South Korea. A group of B-29s, modified to carry nuclear bombs, was sent to Andersen AFB to replace the 19th Group in August 1950. In September, the JCS authorized the Air Force to activate 180 B-29s in reserve and modify them to carry nuclear weapons. General MacArthur reportedly asked the JCS for nuclear weapons as early as July 9, 1950. But Korea was always considered a secondary theater, and General Stratemeyer's requests for aerial reinforcements, for the most part, were refused. Strategic and political factors beyond Korea would compel Stratemeyer to use whatever aerial assets he could obtain. On July 29, 1950, the JCS authorized General Vandenberg to dispatch two more B-29 groups, the 98th and 307th Bombardment Groups, and a strategic reconnaissance squadron from the United States to General O'Donnell's FEAF Bomber Command in Japan. The reinforcements gave O'Donnell a force of two B-29 groups and a reconnaissance squadron at Yokota and three bomber groups at Kadena. The first strategic bombing campaign since World War II was about to begin. On July 30, 47 B-29s from the 22D and 92D bombardment groups bombed the Chosin nitrogen explosives factory in a single attack, with all the superfortresses dropping their bombs in just 4 minutes. Because clouds obscured this North Korean target, the SAC squadrons relied on their APQ-13 bombing radars, justifying SAC's intensive radar training programs. 2 days later, B-29s, flying and bombing visually from 16,000 feet, attacked Chosin's nitrogen fertilizer company. Hungnam's chemical plants came next, and then Wonson's railroad shops and oil refinery. With Bomber Command's decisive success in neutralizing the North Korean Air Force, it was able to employ its most effective bombing tactics. The B-29 superfortresses typically operated in V-shaped formations of 3 aircraft, where the trailing bombers would release their payloads once the lead aircraft initiated its bombing run. When adverse weather conditions, such as cloud cover, obscured the targets, a bomber stream strategy was employed. In this method, individual aircraft crossed the target at 1-minute intervals, utilizing radar for precise bombing. By mid-September 1950, only hydroelectric plants and targets near the Russian and Manchurian borders remained untouched by airstrikes. In just over a month of relentless operations, the FEAF Bomber Command's 5 B-29 groups had achieved their primary objectives. By September 15, 1950, they had flown approximately 4,000 sorties, dropping 30,000 tons of bombs on vital North Korean infrastructure, including factories, chemical plants, oil refineries, arsenals, railroad marshalling yards, locomotive foundries, docks, and warehouses. Despite the intensity of the campaign, only 4 B-29 bombers were lost. Target selection was coordinated through the JCS, SAC, and FEAF's own target section. Following JCS directives, only one hydroelectric plant, located at Fusan, was bombed, while radar-guided strikes near the Soviet border, including an attack on Ration, were halted after bombs fell too close to Soviet territory on August 12. The success of Bomber Command closely mirrored the advances made by UN and South Korean forces on the ground. After a successful amphibious landing at Incheon in South Korea on September 15, MacArthur's forces rolled up North Korean forces from the west and south. On October 19, U.S. forces captured Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. 5 days later, Bomber Command suspended its operations over Korea because no targets were available on the Korean side of the Yalu. Since they were unneeded, 2 conventionally armed SAC B-29 groups left FEAF and returned to the United States. However, Chinese forces entered the Korean War in October 1950. UN and South Korean ground units were hard-pressed and in retreat. On November 30, President Truman stated publicly that the United States would use every weapon that we have. However, he did not favor using nuclear weapons against China. But the same day SAC was ordered to dispatch B-29s equipped to carry nuclear weapon to Guam to replace the ones that had been sent in August and withdrawn at the end of October. At the same time, MacArthur ordered FEAF not to bomb Manchuria or to strike targets north of a line running from Chungjin to Musan near North Korea's border with the Soviet Union. Bomber Command's role in this campaign was to destroy the cities and large towns, and for the first time in this deteriorating military situation, the use of incendiaries was authorized. Chinese armies, however, continued to advance southward. On December 5, 1950, they marched into Pyongyang. While the General Assembly of the UN adopted a resolution urging a negotiated end to the fighting in Korea, giving Truman and MacArthur a diplomatic alternative if they could find an opportune moment to employ it, China, on the march southward, seemed unwilling even to consider that opportunity. Chinese troops captured Seoul, the capital of South Korea, in the first week of January 1951, and their drive south was only halted at the end of that month. By March 15, 1951, UN troops were again in Seoul, and General MacArthur, anxious to strike at the North Koreans and Chinese before any negotiations began, again asked the president for permission to enlarge the war and for authority to use nuclear weapons against Manchurian targets. Truman again refused, although he did have the U.S. delegation to the UN warn their Soviet counterparts that the United States would respond dramatically if Soviet air units, based in either the Soviet Union or Manchuria, attacked UN ground forces fighting in Korea. Both the UN and its communist opponents seem to have tacitly accepted certain limits on the scope of the war. The United States did not bomb Manchuria, and Soviet forces did not intervene directly in the conflict. In February and March 1951, however, it seemed that this understanding might collapse when the JCS received reports the Soviet Union had moved 3 divisions into Manchuria and had positioned other forces for an attack on Japan. On March 27, 1951, the JCS recommended that 9 nuclear cores be transferred to the defense establishment from the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, the civilian agency responsible for developing and stockpiling atomic weapons. On April 6, the president signed an order directing the AEC to release the 9 bomb cores to General Vandenberg, who ordered them flown to Guam where they could be mated with bomb casings stored at Andersen AFB. After General MacArthur was fired by President Truman on April 11, General Ridgway became commander of UN forces in Korea. The JCS authorized him to attack Manchurian and Russian airbase if planes based there assaulted his ground forces as part of a concerted communist offensive. Truman also approved the transfer to Guam of more B-29s to carry atomic bombs, and SAC sent a command and control team to Tokyo, since control of nuclear-armed aircraft was not practicable from SAC headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska. From December 1950 until the Korean armistice in July 1953, the aircraft available to UN air units were always outnumbered in combat, so from FEAF's perspective, the Korean Air War was a conventional campaign of attrition. After Chinese forces crossed the Yalu River from Manchuria into Korea in November 1950, Bomber Command's 3 B-29 groups supported FEAF's interdiction campaign by attacking bridges and railroad tunnels in North Korea. The B-29s also participated in the air superiority struggle by cratering North Korean airfields. Because the MiGs had a limited range, communist engineers continually had to repair the North Korean airfields to extend MiG coverage closer to the 38th parallel. In May 1951, Major General Otto Wayland, who had directed close air support for the Third Army in Europe during World War II, received a promotion and took command of FEAF after General Stratemeyer suffered a heart attack. Wayland's primary concern was to retain air superiority over North Korea. The communist MiG-15s were a major threat to Bomber Command's B-29s because FEAF's range-limited F-84 and F-86 fighters could not easily protect the slower bombers, and the B-29's defensive armament was ill-suited to warding off the fast, highly maneuverable and heavily armed MiGs. In response, Bomber Command shifted from daylight to nighttime raids. As a result, B-29 night sorties increased from 178 in the January through March 1951 period to 496 during April through June and to 1,032 for October through December. What made the night attacks on North Korean airfields possible was the short-range navigation, or SHORAN, system, a method of using radio frequency transmissions to direct B-29s and other aircraft to targets they could not see. A refinement of the World War II British G and oboe, SHORAN consisted of radio transmitters placed at widely separated ground installations and a receiver and computers located on the aircraft. SHORAN-directed attacks by small numbers of bombers became routine for the B-29s of FEAF Bomber Command, and they continued until the fighting ended in July 1953. General Wayland, however, was unwilling to wage an aerial campaign of attrition simply to preserve UN air superiority and interdict the supplies flowing south down the peninsula to North Korean and Chinese troops. To emerge from the armistice talks, begun on July 10, 1951, with a settlement favorable to the UN, Wayland believed his air forces would have to deny Chinese and North Korean ground and air forces both military and psychological initiatives. In May 1952, General Mark Clark replaced Ridgway. On June 17, 1952, Clark ordered Wayland and Vice Admiral Robert P. Briscoe, Commander Naval Forces Far East, to attack the installations at Hyason, Fusan, and Chosin. 2 days later, the JCS approved an attack on Sueho, at that time the fourth largest hydroelectric station in the world. Navy and 5th Air Force fighter bombers opened the attacks with a strike against Sueho on June 23. Because the presence of large numbers of MiGs made daylight raids by Bomber Command's B-29s too risky, the 4-engine veterans had since October 1951 been kept out of the region in northwest North Korea known as MiG Alley during daylight. Smaller, faster fighter bombers, masking their approach to targets by flying at low altitude, could strike and dash off, often before the MiGs could reach them. By June 27, in 4 days these attacks had shut down 90% of North Korea's electric power generation. General Smart, Wayland's operation officer, had also recommended to Wayland that air attacks be designed to undermine the morale of the civilian population actively engaged in the logistic support of the enemy forces. Accordingly, in the first week of July 1952, General Clark and the JCS approved a FEAF Target Committee recommendation that the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, a military as well as political center, be bombed heavily. On July 11, after a warning leaflet drop, fighter bombers of the 5th Air Force, the 7th Fleet, the 1st Marine Air Wing, and Allied units, all shielded from MiG attacks by 5th Air Force F-86 barrier patrols, worked over targets in and around Pyongyang. That night, Bomber Command B-29s made shore and area strikes. In August, UN aircraft attacked the headquarters of North Korea's army and, again, Pyongyang. On September 1, Navy carrier planes attacked North Korea's synthetic oil production plant at Aoji, only 8 miles from the Soviet Union's border. Such attacks were meant to have psychological as well as military impact. On September 9, 1952, for example, 175 MiGs challenged 5th Air Force fighters and fighter bombers attacking North Korea's military academy, north of Pyongyang. At stake in this incident was the image of control. Strictly military considerations were secondary. The commander of the 5th Air Force, Lieutenant General Glenn Barkus, personally led an attack on Radio Pyongyang, all the while broadcasting to North Koreans the taunt in March 1953. Such attacks were part of General Whalen's effort to force the North Koreans to pay a high price for their intransigence at the armistice talks. Whalen's air pressure campaign was supported by a new president, former Army general and the supreme Allied commander in Europe during World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, whose Republican administration was committed to ending the Korean conflict as soon as possible. When the armistice talks stalled yet again in April 1953, the JCS suggested that Eisenhower consider nuclear weapons as a means of forcing a settlement. Like his predecessor, he was reluctant to use such weapons in a limited war. Instead, he authorized Clark to renew air attacks on Yalu River hydroelectric stations and consider new types of targets. FEAF's Target Committee recommended attacking the dams that held the water essential for North Korea's rice farming, and Clark won JCS approval for this action. With General Clark's permission, Whalen ordered 5th Air Force tactical fighter bombers to hit the dam at Toksan, 20 miles north of Pyongyang, on May 13 as a test of this new bombing policy. Weakened by the bombing, the dam collapsed, and General Clark later observed that the resulting flood has been as effective as weeks of rail interdiction. Tactical aircraft attacked and holed another dam near Pyongyang on May 15 and 16, and Bomber Command's B-29s unsuccessfully went after a third in a nighttime Shoran raid on May 21 to 22. Thus, the Eisenhower administration had raised the level of conventional destruction in North Korea another notch. The dam busting not only threatened North Korea's rice crop, it also flooded numerous underground bunkers near Pyongyang. In all, the evidence does not suggest that President Eisenhower overtly threatened to use nuclear weapons. Some tactical nuclear weapons were deployed to the Far East, though not in large numbers because the European theater had a higher priority. By June 1953, Whalen's 49th Fighter Bomber Wing, based in Japan, had one squadron of F-84GS equipped with tactical nuclear weapons. These aircraft were not under SAC's control and their firepower was reserved for a battlefield emergency, such as a desperate, last-ditch effort by the North Koreans and Chinese to gain territory before the signing of an armistice. The armistice was indeed signed on July 27, 1953. General Whalen remained convinced that FEAF's air pressure campaign had been a major factor in persuading the Chinese and North Koreans to accept a settlement. Additionally, evidence exists that the morale of civilian North Koreans was nearly broken by the summer of 1953. Whether true or not, Whalen and the JCS thought the threat of tactical nuclear weapons would deter any violation of the armistice after it was signed. To make clear the strength of U.S. armaments after 2.5 years of new production, the JCS authorized SAC to deploy a wing of B-36 bombers to Guam, Okinawa, in Japan at the end of August 1953. They believed such signals of U.S. strength were essential to deterring further fighting in Korea. Various constraints affected FEAF aerial operations. Bomber Command's initial assault on North Korea's industry and transportation lines in August and September 1950 was the only operation during the war in Korea when strategic bombing was carried out as it had been in World War II. To avoid giving North Korea any propaganda advantage, however, incendiaries were proscribed. When Chinese forces entered the war, General MacArthur's order to regard all villages in communist territory as military targets gave FEAF a free hand to attack civilian morale, but it did not do so. In part this was so because too few aircraft were available for such attacks while simultaneously pursuing air superiority and interdiction. Also, President Truman's desire to maintain unity among UN allies further constrained FEAF's actions. U.S. air war policy was strongly influenced by official British views. Any oversight might lead to a crisis in Allied relations. Even large-scale chaff drops, to cloud enemy radar screens, were forbidden until November 1952. This was to prevent Soviet advisors in North Korea from learning too much about U.S. electronic warfare techniques. No first-line American bombers, not even the B-50, ever appeared in combat over North Korea. B-30 SIXS and B-50s were reserved expressly for possible strategic nuclear strikes and reconnaissance missions. Finally, no theater air commander was present in Korea, contrary to Air Force doctrine. General Stratemeyer had asked General MacArthur for control of all theater air assets in the first days of the war, but U.S. Navy and Marine Corps officers challenged Stratemeyer's request, leaving Air Force-Navy coordination informal and consequently weak. General Mark Clark assured General Wayland he would create a joint Far East Command Headquarters staff in August 1952. Though he eventually did so, the close working coordination during the last year of the war between FEAF and Naval Forces Far East came from the fortunate personalities of the commanders concerned rather than from more stable dictates of command authority and organization. Wayland judged this a serious problem in a stalemated conventional conflict like the one in Korea. He believed the UN command needed to wield its air assets quickly and deftly in combination to gain psychological and political, as well as military, victories. That concludes the full account of strategic bombardment in Korean War. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment to support us in creating more high-quality videos. Thanks for watching.